and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 encounters with Skinwalkers, or cryptids that are perceived to be Skinwalkers by those who encountered them. Skinwalkers are tricky to find stories about because so many people believe they encountered a Skinwalker, but really they came across another type of cryptid that either looks similar or has similar behaviors. In this episode, these stories could very well involve Skinwalkers or something else entirely. Alright, let's get to the first story. The first story of this episode actually includes 3 stories in one. The original story that was posted and 2 additional shorter stories from commenters who replied to the original poster, or OP, about encounters they had in the same area. The area in which these stories take place is Azle, Texas, where the original poster had one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. Azle, Texas is a small city just outside of Fort Worth, Texas, and spans parts of Parker and Tarrant counties. Azle is the home of the Azle Marching Green Pride Marching Band and the Fighting Azle Hornets. As of the 2010 census, it has a population of 10,947 and covers a total area of 8.8 square miles, or 22.9 kilometers. The OP, who is half Native American, lived in Oklahoma with his family and never believed any of the stories he heard as a kid. That is, until he had a real encounter. When he was in the 4th grade, he took a trip with his family to Texas to visit his grandparents. Their property was encompassed by a few acres of land, which meant the OP would wander off and explore the surrounding area when he had the chance. One afternoon, when he went for a walk in the woods like he normally did, is when his encounter would take place. He was no farther than 5 minutes into the walk and could still see his grandparents' house when he heard his mother's voice call out his name. It sounded far away and very distorted, but at the same time, it sounded close. He called back to what he thought was his mother and looked around, but instead of seeing her, he saw a tall creature standing behind a tree. The OP describes the being as having gray, tattered skin and gnarly teeth. He stopped and stared at the creature in complete shock by how terrifying this thing was. It started to move out from behind the tree, but the OP wasn't going to stick around to see what this thing was going to do. He turned and took off running for his grandparents' house as tears streamed down his face. Luckily, he made it back without further incident and did not tell anyone what happened for more than a year. Before this incident, he had never had a paranormal or cryptid encounter, but from that point on, no matter where he traveled to or moved to, he would have encounters. He posted his story 3 years ago when he was only 18 years old and says he has had countless encounters by that point. He posted his story thinking this thing was a skinwalker, especially having heard the stories his whole life, but wanted to get some other opinions from people who live in the same area and see if they have had similar experiences. The first additional story from this post comes from a commenter who replied to the OP by sharing their friend's story. Their friend's encounter took place near mineral wells in the area near Azle, which is very rural. There is a hidden cemetery where a high school boy was found murdered back in the mid-90s. Her friend and another of their friends visited the cemetery just to have a look around because of the lore, when they spotted a creature that abruptly stood up about 50 yards away. They described the beast as looking like a goat man and absolutely not human. It started walking toward them in broad daylight, and the 2 girls ran to their car with this thing following them, walking on 2 feet. They were able to reach the car before the creature reached them and quickly left the cemetery. The commenter believed his friends because of the sincerity in which she told the story. The second additional story comes from another commenter who thinks he also encountered a skinwalker. He was camping with his friends one night, and one of his friends left their phone behind in the forest. He doesn't say if it was by the campsite or where, just that his friend left their phone. They went back to retrieve it, but a wave of fear came over the commenter, so he stopped and waited for his friends to go grab the phone, standing in the middle of the road. While he was waiting, he happened to glance over and see a pair of yellow eyes watching him from the trees. At first, he thought nothing of it and dismissed them as belonging to a fox or another woodland critter. But then whatever the eyes belonged to stood up. He says the eyes rose so high that they looked like they belonged to a creature that was 7 to 10 feet tall. He froze in fear, but before anything else could happen, his friends came back down the road. He looked back into the woods, but the creature was gone. It seems as though Azle, Texas, and the surrounding area is a hotbed for cryptid activity. As for the first story, the thought of hearing your mother's voice only to look around and see a creature standing behind a tree would be absolutely terrifying. I don't blame the OP for running in that situation. As for what the creature was, him being half Native American and growing up on Skinwalker and similar stories makes me inclined to believe him when he says that's what it was. As for why he started having a lot of encounters wherever he went, maybe he was marked by this creature or something else. Sometimes all it takes is for one to happen to open the floodgate. As for the second story, I've heard very few Goatman stories and was happy to come across one I could share on the channel, even if it is just a short one like this one. Just like with some of the other lesser known cryptids, I would love to be able to do more stories about them. They're just so hard to come by. This story also sounds terrifying. To have some unknown creature that's definitely not human suddenly appear and chase you definitely would leave a mark. Luckily, the girls were able to escape. As for the third story, I'm not 100% sold he encountered a Skinwalker that night. It very well could have been, but being that he didn't see anything except eyes, it's hard to say for a fact that's what it was. Another cryptid that comes to mind that is often described as having yellow eyes and being that tall is the Dogman. It could have also been a Bigfoot. However, you can't completely rule out a Skinwalker either. What do you think the original poster saw? And what do you think of the other two stories? The next story takes place in Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation is located in the southwest United States and is a major hotspot for Skinwalker activity, as the majority of sightings in the US are attributed to this region. Some believe Skinwalkers are only in this region, as it is part of Navajo legend and lore. However, according to the 2010 census, only 173,667 out of 332,129 Navajo tribal members live in Navajo Nation. Some who do not live in Navajo Nation live in the surrounding areas, but others live elsewhere in the United States. That is why I believe you cannot box in Skinwalkers to just this region, with a large number of Navajo people living elsewhere in the US, as well as the high population of First Nation people living in Canada. The Navajo Nation reservation covers more than 17.5 million acres and is the largest land area held by Native Americans in the United States. It covers parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The original poster was staying at an Airbnb near Monument Valley with his friends at the time of the encounter. They had a gorgeous view of the valley from the front door of the place they were staying, and the weather was cold, but it was still cozy. There were even some friendly dogs roaming the area, so they got to spend some quality time with them, even his friend who is deathly afraid of dogs. Their trip was off to a great start. One night during their stay, the OP needed to use the bathroom. He opened the door to the dogs going crazy outside. He points out that the dogs bark differently when they are barking at something outside or a person walking by. But the way they were barking this night was something else entirely. He describes it as a fight-or-flight response. One of the dogs immediately ran up to him as he exited the house. It was clearly anxious and kept looking out into the desert. The dog had its haki up and, in that moment, to the OP looked more like a wolf than a dog as it took off into the desert after a large shadowy figure. The figure ran away from the dog. He says there aren't many big animals in the area, some deer, horses, maybe some cattle, but the dark figure he saw running into the desert was even bigger. He did not want to stick around to find out what this thing was, so he went back inside, shaken up by what he had seen. The next morning, he inspected the area and found fresh wolf or mountain lion prints and hoof prints he guesses belonged to a horse. The dog prints were much smaller than the rest. The OP wanted to believe that it was a horse he saw that night, but their host said it might have been a Skinwalker, but wouldn't say anything else about the matter. He later met some guides who said the same thing, that it could have been a Skinwalker, but they also would not talk about it any further than saying what they thought it was. During a tour later that day, one of his friends became ill and almost passed out, something that had never happened to her in her entire life. The guide says she might have had some bad spirits attached to her. She recovered not long after the incident. All in all, the OP says it was a great trip and that he would love to go back someday if he ever has the chance. One commenter agrees that the dark figure he saw in the desert was out of the ordinary, because the dog would not react that way if it was just another person. Besides, he said all the dogs were very friendly, and even his friend who is deathly afraid of dogs had no problem with them. Without a better description of what the OP saw, it's hard to say for sure if this was a skinwalker. But given the location of the story, you can't completely rule it out. However, it very well could have been another animal out there. He does say, though, that it was much larger than the other bigger animals you see in that area. What do you think he saw that night? The next story comes from a poster who saw something that made her believe in skinwalkers. She does not say exactly where her story took place, just that she and her boyfriend bought a house on a lake about an hour northeast of Seattle, Washington. Their house backs up to the Cascade Mountains. The Cascade Mountain Range is a major mountain range in western North America. It extends from British Columbia in Canada through Washington State and Oregon into Northern California. The highest peak in the range is Mount Rainier in Washington, which reaches an elevation of 14,411 feet, or 4,392 kilometers. Other than the community where they live near the lake, she says the population in the area is small. They live in a rural area that is between some larger towns about 20 minutes away driving. They are the last area where people live before reaching the Cascade Mountains. Approximately 30 yards from their driveway is a road that breaks off from the main lake road. It goes a few miles into the woods before it ends in a dead end. There are a few logging roads that branch off of this road that the OP and her boyfriend rode dirt bikes on. They stretch out into the wilderness for miles. The only houses out where they ride are on the main dead-end road. Before they started riding their dirt bikes up the main road and the logging roads that branch off of it, the OP would take walks up this road exploring the area. It always felt a bit off to her, and her boyfriend always said it felt creepy, even during the day. It was densely forested in some spots, which created a lot of shade in those areas, and there weren't a lot of houses around, which the OP says could be the reason it felt off. But there is one main reason why she stopped taking walks up this road. When she first moved into the house, she was dog sitting for a friend. The dog was a 70-pound pit bull that she describes as a fearless brat. She could be aggressive with other dogs and also, at times, with people. While she was dog sitting, she would take the dog for walks down this road because there wasn't a lot of traffic or people around. One day they were walking the road as usual and were about 2 miles from her house. They came to a treeless area where an abandoned barn sat in a large field that the road cut through. The grass on both sides of the road was very tall. When they reached the field, the OP noticed that the dog's tail immediately went down as she lowered her head closer to the ground. The dog began scanning the area around them and behind them, acting nervous, which was completely out of character for her. They came around a bend in the road where a logging trail branches off, going straight up a hill. There was a large gate up the hill blocking the road that the OP and her boyfriend had maneuvered their dirt bikes under to ride down that logging trail, so she knew how high the gate was. She is 5'5" and the gate came up to her chest. Standing at the gate was a huge black dog with its head low to the ground, but she could have sworn it was looking in her direction. She could not make out the snout or ears and did not see a tail, but thinks that it could have been tucked between this thing's hind legs. However, standing on all fours, its shoulders were higher than the top of the gate. She distinctly remembers the feeling of dread and terror that came over her as she looked upon this creature. It was a fear unlike anything she had ever felt before. She was about 100 yards away from this huge black dog, but this thing growled and she heard it. The growl was an awful hissing type growl that terrified her and the dog. She and the dog both took off running back toward her house. She kept looking over her shoulder the entire way but did not stop for a second. It took her a long time to get over the incident to feel safe in her house, especially at night. And even to this day, she does not like being home alone. Her boyfriend says she just saw a black bear, but she grew up in rural Pennsylvania and has seen many black bears in her life. This thing was not a black bear. It had long, skinny legs, a deep, curved rib cage, and a belly similar to a Doberman's. She says if it was a wolf, it would have been an abnormally large wolf and very skinny. In doing some research, she came across some Skinwalker stories and believes this is what she encountered that day because it shares a lot of similarities. Whatever it was though, she knows it was not natural and it was not normal. This to me sounds like a dogman. I know a lot of Skinwalker stories involve seeing a wolf-like creature, but I just get dogman vibes from this one, especially with the description and the growl. However, you can't completely dismiss Skinwalker. What do you think she saw that day? The final story of this episode comes from a poster who tells a story that was told to them by a friend. The original poster is admittedly a skeptic and a cynic, so they aren't entirely sure they believe this encounter. He has known the person who this happened to for many years and values his insight and advice, calling it always well-reasoned and helpful. Being that this is the case, he takes his friend's word for it that what he has told him is the truth. However, he does take it with a grain of salt. Now that that is all out of the way, on to the story. The OP's friend, who we will call M, enjoys camping and usually goes by himself. He does this so he can be one with nature and enjoy the wilderness and outdoors, and everything that comes along with it. He is also a gun enthusiast and an avid collector. His encounter took place close to Cascade National Forest, which is located in south-central Louisiana. Cascade National Forest is the lone national forest located in the state of Louisiana. It is part of the Cenozoic uplands and is made up of large areas of longleaf pine forests. It is one of the largest areas of natural landscape in the state and covers an area of just over 600,000 acres. When M embarked on his camping trip, he took his camping gear and a few guns and headed out to a property close to the Cascade National Forest that his friend owns. He would hike deep into the land to a specific spot that he had found during previous trips. He set up camp as usual and settled in for the night. A few hours later, though, he began hearing leaves crunching and twigs snapping as if being stepped on. He figured it was an animal coming to get a closer look at what he was cooking over his campfire. But when he looked into the trees, he saw a man approaching in the distance. M has made a habit of being very cordial to people he comes across in the wilderness, but always keeps his guard up and is always looking for any ulterior motives the people might have. He never knows if people he comes across are armed, as he is, or what they might be up to out in the middle of nowhere. He's never come across anyone with sneaky or evil intentions, other than this particular experience. The first thing that sent up red flags was that no one except M had permission to be on this property. The next was how this person was dressed. He was wearing a white t-shirt, jogging shorts, and socks and sneakers. M's campsite was miles away from any roads or trails, so no one would just stumble across him out for a leisurely stroll or hike, especially dressed as casually as this person was, unless of course they had gotten lost. It was fall but not particularly cool, as was normal in Louisiana, but the OP points out that there are a lot of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects that you wouldn't want on you, so anyone out that far in the wilderness would not have exposed so much skin. By the look of it, M thinks the person approaching his camp might need help, so he calls out to him and asks if that's the case. He did so loud enough to be heard, but the man did not answer. He just continued to walk directly toward M while staring at him the entire time. The OP describes M as someone who isn't easily unnerved, but the man's demeanor did the trick. He began to grow more uneasy the closer this person got to his camp. Finally, M stood and asked the man loudly if he could help him with something. By this point, the man was about 15 to 20 feet away, standing in the trees on the edge of the clearing. The man, while making direct, unnerving eye contact, clearly says, "Help me." However, how the man said this did not sound right to M. He was growing more anxious by the second. He describes it as if this person who was saying this did not know exactly how to talk. He again said, "Help me," but this time with more urgency, but not that much louder than the first time. This is when M really noticed what was wrong with the man. The voice emanating from this man sounded more like a female's voice, and as if it was a recording being played back. The man's lips and mouth did not sync up with the words as he was speaking. It was like he was opening his mouth for the phrase to play before he closed it again. M asked the man what he needed help with, but he just stood there motionless, staring into his eyes, and once again said, "Help me." He repeated this 3 more times. M interrupted the man by telling him in a loud, firm tone that he needed to leave immediately if he did not need help, before asking him one more time if he needed help or not. The weird man did not miss a beat and just repeated "help me" over and over until M had had enough. He did the only thing he could think of in that moment that made any sense to him, and that was pull his handgun as the man made a move toward him. He pointed the gun at the man and tells him he needed to go now. The weird, sinister man became agitated and grew more animated in his response, with his "help me's" growing louder. But he did not move closer or farther away from M. This is when M fired a shot into the ground between him and the man. The man fell silent, but held his eye contact with M before flipping backward into the forest and disappearing. The OP says here that this part of the story gave them pause and they had the same reaction you probably just did, that this is BS for sure. But they said that M described the events on numerous occasions in such a serious demeanor with no indication he was exaggerating at all. He had no choice but to believe him. It was like something was attached to the back of this man and it had jerked him away into the forest at that point. M describes it as inhuman and unnatural. He stood and stared into the forest where the man had just been but saw and heard nothing. He remained there until the sun came up and the normal forest sounds returned. M, who the OP describes as unshakable, actually stayed another night before he went home. Later, after reflecting a bit on the incident, M told his friends it definitely sounded like a female voice coming from this thing, almost as if being mimicked by a parrot. He felt like it was an attempt to lure him out of his camp, but he does not know what it wanted. The thing, whatever it was, reacted immediately to the gunshot and fled. He said he did hear what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance early in the morning hours that sounded eerily similar to the handgun he fired. He thought he heard it again when he was leaving, but says people do hunt out there. He has returned to the property since this incident and has never had any other experiences in that area. Because of this incident and another he had in a different location, he did some research and found a lot of legends, stories, and supposed encounters with skinwalkers in the Cascade National Forest. There is also a lot of Native American folklore that has to do with the area, as well as mention of mimics and other similar creatures. Many of the details of his encounter align with these legends, and his tale makes even the OP, who is a skeptic, wonder what could be lurking in the remote, untouched areas of the world. This would be an absolutely terrifying ordeal to go through, and I can say for certain that I would not have stayed the next night or have gone back to that area again. How he did so is beyond me. As for what this thing was, the OP put both Skinwalker and Mimic in the title of the post, but I don't think this was a Skinwalker. Most likely it was a Mimic, but I can't help but think it could also have been a demon. Whatever it was certainly seemed evil and like it had malicious intent when it came to M. I could see how he could think it was trying to lure him into the forest. Usually people just hear the voice and it sounds like it is off in the distance. They don't usually actually see where it's coming from. As for it sounding like a recorded clip being played on a loop, I've heard this in many stories involving skinwalkers. So who knows? Maybe it could have been one. What do you think it was? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.